Hey everyone, what's up? We're having a tech talk. Woo! All right. And yes, Jess has pushed the appropriate button. We are recording. Excellent. So for today, I really wanted to share some of the stuff that we've been doing in mobility, and a lot of that is pretty tightly integrated with what's available on Azure. Now, you may be thinking, Slater, are you like an Azure evangelist now? Are you just so excited about Azure? It may have something to do with the client in this case, that we were talking about Azure and not, say, GCP or AWS. Nevertheless, we shall continue. Now, I've called this a case study in mature tooling. Why is that? Well, when we started this project in Mobility, we were using Node and Express. So what's awesome about using Node and an Express server? Well, it's super simple to get started. You can do like an Express server in, I don't know, 5 or 10 lines of code. And just start adding stuff and developing right away. And so when we were in the beginning parts of this project, that's kind of what we needed to do. We were trying to get a proof of concept out the door. We wanted to like register a lot of routes and just do some stuff. There's a really low learning curve in Express. And part of that is because Express isn't like terribly opinionated about how you do whatever you want to do. Very much sort of in the vein of JavaScript. It's like, hey man, do you want to return an error in an object with a 200 response? You do that. You do you, man. Whatever you want. And so we had some of that going on. Also, lots of folks here are very adept in JavaScript, so it's really comfortable for us to get up and running in JavaScript. But we reached a point, and this is, I think, a question that we have to ask a lot of ourselves and of our clients is, when do we need to trade the ability for us to move and iterate very, very quickly with the ability for us to maintain what we have in the future, and how do we best enable that? So why did we make the decision to move away from Node? Well, we didn't have to conform to any particular pattern. Express is pretty loose with what it'll let you do. There was no real support for some of the weird legacy Microsoft Exchange token validation that we needed to do as a result of our project. Can you integrate an Express server with Microsoft services on Azure? Yeah. Probably, mostly, sometimes, but it can be really difficult to find code examples for that stuff, and you have to kind of roll your own on some things, and maybe it is supported, maybe it isn't, and that can get to be difficult, again, if you still kind of want to move quickly. Also, we were just kind of like logging to a file on the server, which is a terrible idea, because if you need to inspect your logs, then you got to log into the server, you got to retrieve that file. If that file got too big, maybe you crashed your server. And there are all kinds of reasons not to do that. Now, can we configure an Azure service to do it? We can, but it didn't immediately work, and then we weren't sure why, and that kind of stuff. Also, I don't know if you all have worked with the Node debugger locally or otherwise. It's an experience, not a great experience. So you can set up debugging in Node, but it's another thing that just like it takes extra time. And for me, when I'm developing, there are just a vast number of decisions that I personally don't want to make. I don't want to set up my own custom debugging environment. I don't want to make my own API design patterns. I don't want to do my own dependency injection model. I just want to use something that's there. So we moved to .NET. Why? Well, Microsoft shit works pretty well with other Microsoft shit. And so, at the time, here's what I thought that we were going to get. I thought, hey, we're probably going to have much better libraries to integrate with all this Microsoft OAuth stuff that we're trying to do, to integrate with our other services. I was, again, particularly interested in application insights because I didn't want to log to a file on the server. And I figured, hey, at least we should get some more sample code so that we're not trying to hunt down how do I configure. And those are all good reasons. But what we actually got was like so much more than that. .NET, love it or hate it, it's a mature system. And so I don't have to reinvent the wheel on anything that's standard. If I want to build a standard API, I follow .NET standards and I get one. if I want API documentation without having to think very much about it, well, people pretty much use Swagger for that. And so there are lots of code examples. You get Swagger set up in half an hour. We also, since we've converted to .NET, we added 5 new Azure technologies, which we'll talk about. We got Azure Functions, we got Application Insights, we have a Service Bus queue, we're using Managed Service Identities, we're using Key Vault, and particularly with Key Vault, which we did in the last week, I looked at a code example. I followed the code example, I ran some commands in the command line, and it worked the first time. And I was like, this is awesome. This never happens. That makes my life so much easier, because at the end of the day, like I don't really want to spend a lot of like my time and my thinking brain power for like, how do I manage secrets? There's a standard way, you do it the standard way, and you get on with your life. Also, I am sort of pretty excited about line item number 4 here, which is that you can actually live debug what is on the server from your local Visual Studio instance. So not only can I log into Application Insights and see, oh, hey, I've got a null reference exception. I can see the line of code that it's on. I can attach my instance to the server. I can put a breakpoint, and I can actually see what is happening on the server in real time, so that I know how to fix it. So that's pretty great. And then, of course, you see Paul is here today. We get a lot of great help from the folks at Microsoft, which is a little simpler now that we're actually living in their ecosystem and writing on their platform. So I said that this was a talk about Azure. I haven't really talked much about Azure. So when I think about what makes Azure or Microsoft services different from AWS or different from Google Cloud Platform? The way I frame it in my mind is, well, of course, it's cloud services, you're hosting your app, whatever. But Microsoft has this tendency to really focus on their clients as businesses. They're not really catering to hobby developers. They're not really catering to folks who just want to like put up a little website. They're catering to businesses, and often very large businesses. So when we talk about, well, what are some concepts that are existing in Azure? One is that if you as a developer kind of just want to go in there and poke around and do a couple things to see how it works, that can be a little tough. Because you have to have a subscription set up and you have to pay for it. And sometimes they'll give you like, oh, this is $400 free, because so you can poke around as a developer, but you still have to give it your credit card and do all this stuff, as opposed to going on Heroku where you're like, hey, give me my hobby dev instance for free, and they will do that. There's a concept in Azure of a tenant, and you can think of a tenant as essentially your business. So like GenUI has a tenant. There's nothing meaningful on there because we don't pay for our own stuff. We are in this project on Microsoft's tenant. There's tons of stuff on there, but that's really a business level entity that is managing all of your applications, all of your cloud services, all of your email addresses, for that matter, is going to live on a tenant. Another key concept in Azure is called a resource group. And my personal understanding of what a resource group is and how best to leverage them is changing, but essentially, if you want to provision a little package of things and then build them all together, you'll build them into a resource group. Why is that helpful? Well, that means that if I want to spin up a new dev instance and provision all the little cloud services that I need for my dev instance, I could do that as a part of just one resource group. And then when I'm done with it, because we don't have a second pair on the project or whatever, then I can delete it all at once. And that is one way to measure or manage all your stuff in Azure, which can get to be pretty unmanageable. As you can envision, like we're on Microsoft's tenant, even just for our stuff, we've got like, oh, I made this resource and that resource, and there's an app service, and there's a key vault, and there's a this, and there's a that. And if there's no like underlying system for how they're all put together, it can get to be a lot to sort of wade through. And finally, there's the Azure CLI. So the Azure portal is what you would see if you went onto the website and you logged in, and there's a nice GUI there for you. But you can do a lot of what's possible in Azure through a command line interface, which can be really useful, again, if you're like writing scripts and trying to dynamically allocate and deallocate stuff. Cool. So I mentioned Application Insights. I've been mentioning Application Insights. I'm so excited about Application Insights. Why is that? Well, you get a lot of stuff for free. When I log into Azure and I go to our app and I look at our Application Insights instance, this is on prod, I can see that something is failing once every, 5 minutes in prod. I can see my average server response time. I can see my server requests, and I can drill in actually and see, well, how many requests are made on which endpoints with what frequency? Do they fail? What are the exceptions when they do fail? How many users do I have? How long do those users spend on the site? What browsers are those users using when they come to our site? And I get all of that simply as a result of having included Application Insights on my project. I've added some custom logs, but those are just logs. That's just me trying to see what's going on in our service. I can see every call that's been made to every one of our other server dependencies and whether it succeeded or failed. So in terms of, again, our ability to debug what's happening on the server without having to go in and do a bunch of custom stuff, that has suddenly become extremely easy just as a result of using Application Insights. So how hard was that to add to our project? Literally in Visual Studio, you just right click and you say add Application Insights. And then you keep clicking until it says that you have Application Insights. It's really that simple. What else do I have? This is basically everything I just said. Oh yeah, I really want to do this. I haven't done it yet, but if I want, I can create custom stats in Application Insights, which I do. We want to know who's taking shuttles. We want to know how often folks are canceling their reservations. In addition to just, is anyone using the app? That is a key piece of information. And so I can collect it, I can run a report, I can make all those nice charts and graphs or whatever, and then I can send an automated email once a week to everyone on the project. So that's pretty cool. And I can configure alerts. So if and I am meaning to do this, if our matching algorithm just falls down and can't pick itself back up, which happened recently, that actually has an error severity level on it. And so I can set it up to say, hey, if we're getting an error of this level of severity, please send me an email. And that's again, nothing is free in Azure. We already discussed. It's $1.50 for every month for that notification. Yeah, that's right. Hey, then at least we would know that our service had fallen down and we needed to do something about it. Cool. So speaking of our matcher, when we had built this app in Node, we had a long-running daemon process happening in the background, which is creating rideshares. It's going to see, hey, do we have new reservations? Do we need to match people up? And it's running more or less continuously. We went ahead and we moved this to Azure Functions, but not just because serverless is so cool right now, although I'm going to say serverless is so cool right now. But because having this as an Azure function allows us to take advantage of some security benefits, again, which are all integrated as a part of Azure. We'll talk about that in a minute. So our Azure function is running on a timer, like a cron job, every 5 seconds. And we can monitor it here. So we can see, hey, we've had many, many successful runs of this in the past 30 days and a few that failed. I can go ahead and run the same query in Application Insights, get some more information as it relates to that. I can actually also click into here and watch it run if I have nothing better to do. So running an Azure function, a serverless function on a timer is one way you can do serverless, but you can also set serverless in front of a queue. So it's receiving messages from an external queue and reacting in that way. You can set up a function as an API endpoint. So you're actually making web requests to your serverless function. And one of the primary benefits of it, other than security, is that you're only paying for the compute time that you actually use. So particularly in the case of an API, It'll scale depending on how many requests it gets, so you don't have to worry about that. And then you only pay for what you actually use. When I went to MS Build last year, I ran into some guys who worked for some like national dentistry practice. They were so excited about Azure Functions. It just made their billing so much simpler than it had been for running all these websites for dentists. And so presumably if you had a lot of clients, if you needed to support lots of different businesses, then you could actually sort of parse out and only really bill them for what they're using in addition to you only paying for what you're using. Yep. There's all that stuff. Cool. So queues, what about that queue? We are doing a couple of things in our app that take a little longer than is convenient for just using for an API. So for instance, when you make a new rideshare as a user, what you actually want to see, the experience you want to have from the front end is that you click a button and it says okay. It should say okay pretty quickly. You should not have to wait 5 seconds for it to say okay. But unfortunately, we need, I don't know, not 5 seconds, but we need a little more time because what we're doing under the hood is we do save to our database, but then we also go out to MS Graph, which is where the user's calendar lives, and we're putting some stuff on their calendar, we're updating their calendar. I feel like we're something else too. Anyway, it takes a little time. And we didn't want to take that time in the API itself. And so instead what we do is we send the message to a queue. And that queue looks like that, yes. So we send a message to the queue, and then the queue will spit back responses to a listener. Now, we happen to set up our listener to live in our API as well, but it could live in an Azure function, it could live in another application, it can really be anywhere. And then in the background, we go ahead and do all that mucking around with the user's calendar and this other stuff that takes some time. Do I have other stuff to say about that? Oh yeah, so when I go into Azure, this is what my queue looks like. It can tell me how many messages were scheduled. It can tell me actually in another tab how many messages it's been sending and receiving lately. I can schedule messages with the queue. So if, for instance, I only want to call a shuttle for the user at the time that they need a shuttle, then I just tell my queue, hey, send me this message back again, tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock, and it'll do that. So, one of the downsides is that it'll do that within the context of this system where it's still only receiving and then sending messages one at a time. So there is a latency issue where if you needed something to happen like immediately, queues maybe not the best system, but you don't have fine-tuned control over how quickly you receive those messages back. But it has for us been a pretty good system to kick stuff off in the background on demand. Cool. So what we have been working on in the past couple of weeks is enterprise level security, which has been an interesting thing to tackle. As Paul will tell you, Microsoft gets hacked all the time, or tries to get hacked all the time, because they're a high level target. And so it's necessary for us to take a couple of extra steps. We, as an application, have permission to read and write onto everybody's calendar. So if Satya Nadella uses our app, then we can put stuff on his calendar. We want to make sure that we protect that. And we also have the ability to read all of the profiles of all of the users at Microsoft. So that's some pretty powerful stuff, and we want to make sure that our secrets are secret. So we are using Key Vault for that. It's another Azure service. And because everything is nice and integrated and we're in this Microsoft environment, what you're looking at here is code that gets run in .NET Core when the application runs. And we're getting most of our configuration settings from our own settings files. That's what that is. But then we'll go ahead and just pop some environment variables into there, and then connect to Key Vaults and throw all of our secrets into the config too. So we're able to, this is 6 lines of code, go ahead and pop into all of the various places where we might keep environment settings, mash them together, and then just use them throughout our application without me having to think about how that works or having to do something custom or special. This is just some sample code. I pasted it, it worked. We all got on with our lives. Finally, in order to connect to that key vault, we can use a password. But then, of course, the whole point of using the key vault for your passwords is that your passwords are not in your code or in another place that's easier to compromise. And so we're using something called the Managed Service Identity. So Microsoft has this really helpful diagram to talk about what managed service identity is. In my mind, the way that I have been thinking about it is our application, when it runs in Azure, is unique. It lives on a VM. It has its own kind of fingerprint. And so rather than saying, hey, I have a key or I have a password to get into that key vault, it says, hey, I am myself. I'm using a fingerprint. Please let me in. You said that I could be in. And that is how we are accessing our secrets in Key Vault. We're able to use this also to access our database, or that's what Paul and I are working on today, so that we're really just trying to remove points of vulnerability so that we can get into our stuff securely. So I think that's it. Yeah, so those are the things we've been doing on Azure. Are there any questions?
Can you just speak to the fingerprint part a little bit more detail?
No, not really.
Okay.
Paul, can you speak to that?
Yes, basically, since you're running an Azure, and Azure controls all of the infrastructure, while you're running as an app service, it just says your code is running in our environment. We know that you are that app service. Your identity is actually that service. And so when you connect to Key Vault, you don't provide a password. You just say, hey, I'm running in Azure under this, in this context, just give me access. And it gives you access without needing anything more. Exactly. By virtue of the fact you're running there.
So you mentioned how you started using Node and Express, and I think that was other people who were working on that project at the time. Would you recommend doing that again for like future projects and then switching over to Microsoft Azure if it becomes, or .NET, sorry?
I think that these are always difficult conversations to have and decisions to make, especially when you're at the beginning of the project and you may or may not know where it's headed. So, I mean, really, I'm going to say it depends on the project and the expertise of the people involved and you know, kind of trying to walk that line. Certainly for me, for many of our projects with Microsoft as a client, and especially because we're having more and more folks here who have some facility with .NET. Certainly, if I were looking this kind of project in the face again, I would have started in .NET.
And so I heard that you said that Azure is really expensive, but or it costs money as opposed to like other services. But for other projects, would you use Azure or .NET to get all of those things that come with it, like application insights and all that stuff?
Well, I'd have to look a lot more closely at the pricing model than I have. Given that Microsoft is our client, I think you probably discount stuff for yourself. Yeah, so it's been kind of fun to just say like, well, we can play around with this stuff because you know we're doing it for Microsoft. For another client, I would be a lot more careful about, you know, what do these things actually cost? Like I say, I'm not suddenly an Azure evangelist. It's just what we've been using. I really liked GCP when we were working on that with politics last year. And it would be worth investigating. The last time I was on AWS, it was a nightmare, but I assume their UI is somewhat better now. Although that could be wrong. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, it's still frightening.
So,
Cool. Thank you.
I just wanted to say how thrilled I am at this foray into Azure and how deeply you've explored it, and a lot of great insights in here. And it's clearly, you know, a really key area for us, and something that we'll do more and more of, in addition to AWS and GCP and, you know, Node and Express on Heroku. It takes all kinds, you know, and different strokes But we absolutely want to curate a conversation about what we care about as a community and what we think is good as a community and what we think is better than others. And not all of us are going to agree all the time, and that's what makes it a healthy discourse. So I think it's a really valuable perspective that you've presented, and I'm more eager about Azure than in the past, just after having watched it. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and seems like it's pretty decent stuff. AWS, to your question, yeah, last time I touched it was still pretty Byzantine. There are people who know how to navigate through it pretty well. But yeah, there's a lot in there. So
so you didn't start on .NET, and I know that you sort of felt the pain of wanting to switch over to it. How did you think about sort of the trade-offs of that? How did you communicate it to the client? And then Paul, to you, like how did that play out in your mind from a cost perspective?
Yeah. Well, I certainly hope that Microsoft is happy with that decision. I'm thrilled, but boy, there were some moments where I was concerned it took considerably longer than I had anticipated, and it also happened at a time that we had a sudden influx of folks on the project because we suddenly sort of had some more budget, and also it was the holidays, so people were in and out and that kind of thing. Ultimately, as a result of that, having so many folks in the code base, it's much better than if I had gone and done it myself. So that was extremely valuable. And our ability to the code base is so much more tested now than it was because .NET Core has this dependency injection model. So we just kind of got onto that by default, and then as a result, our code did get a lot better, and it's just so much easier to integrate with all this other stuff. When I was thinking about it, I was really thinking specifically about Microsoft authentication. But now that we have this security review, I'm like thinking about trying to do that in Node. I'm glad that we don't have to.
So to the question specifically of cost, for us, it is literally free for our organization. I'm running up much more higher costs than some of our other projects, and no one's giving me any pushback. So that's just part of being in Microsoft. In terms of like the decision point to switch over to C#, I didn't actually kind of even push for that. I didn't even realize that the team was having so many problems with interacting with the security model in Azure in Node. So they came to me and said, hey, we're thinking of doing C#. And I was like, well, that's great. That sort of fits nicely with my skill set. So I was very happy with that, but I certainly didn't push for that.
Yeah, no, that was absolutely from our end. But now we have the added benefit of having Paul come and help us with stuff he knows about. So I'm loving it.
Awesome tech talking discussions there. Thanks for facilitating it.
My pleasure.
Really cool that you're leading us in this direction.
Okay. All right. Yeah.